add everybody into the room, so please sit tight and we will get started in just a moment. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It takes Zoom about a minute to add everybody into the room, so please sit tight and we'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you. Okay, hopefully Zoom has had time to add everybody into the room, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media Briefing on racial justice. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications and I'll be moderating this event. With an election looming, white Americans remain polarized over the racial justice protests that followed the repeating police killings of Black Americans this year. We have three Duke scholars with us today to discuss the protests and where this moment fits into the history of racial identity in this country. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. We are recording this briefing and that recording will be sent to everyone who registered. Thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today is Adriane Lentz-Smith. She is Associate Professor and Associate Chair in Duke's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, and modern America. She's also working on a book about police violence during the twilight of the Civil Rights era. Also joining us is Ashley Jardina. She is an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Duke, where she studies how racial attitudes and group identities influence political preferences and behavior. She is the author of a 2019 book, White Identity Politics. And we have Gunther Peck, who will be joining us in just a few moments. He is an Associate Professor of History and an Associate Professor of Public Policy at Duke, where he also directs the Hart Leadership Program. He researches the history of human trafficking and its relationship to the evolution of racial ideology, humanitarian intervention, and immigration policy in North America and Europe. Okay, and I see that we have Professor Peck with us now, fortunately. Fantastic. So good morning to all three of our panelists. And we'll go ahead and get started. Professor Lentz-Smith, I'd like to start with you. The protests that began after the killing of George Floyd continued across the country through the summer, as did continued police killings of unarmed Black citizens, and the country remains sharply polarized. What, if anything, stands out to you as the most significant development of the summer, and where should we really be focusing our efforts and attention right now?
So here, I'm writing it down because it's a long question. There are a few things that stand out to me as significant from this summer. And the question of where we should focus our efforts is a really huge question. One of the things that I'll say as preface, though, is that we need to be careful, or I'm always hesitant to talk about the country as sharply polarized, as if there aren't a spectrum of responses and a variety of responses to little pieces of things, but also because we tend to talk about polarization as though it's something that just happens organically, as opposed to something that has been fostered, nurtured, and intensified for political purposes. One of the striking developments to me this summer is not simply the intensity and the pain that we hear in the various protests about COVID, about police violence, about other manifestations of anti-democratic practice and inequity, but the intensity of the response to delegitimize and invalidate those protests. And as a historian, what I find particularly striking is how quickly we return to a playbook from 1968 that was, in that moment, all about the Republican Party and then the extremes beyond that. So Nixon and, say, George Wallace, taking the language of Jim Crow, or taking the practices of Jim Crow and putting them in the language of law and order. right? So in 1968, part of their strategy in getting what Nixon called the silent majority, which was many mainstream white Americans tired of being responsible for anti-racism, their strategy was to talk about violence and upheaval as if that were the problem, and as if it weren't, and as if protests were the problem, not as if protests were the response to the problem. And we're in that moment again. On the one hand, we have a huge number of people, multi-ethnic, multiracial, on the streets saying that the anti-democratic practices of this country have been bad for our health and our well-being, and all of us broadly, and certain historically underrepresented communities even more so. And it's wrong, and we want change. And then we have an administration in power that has decided that rather than listen and respond and reform, they would rather attack, downplay, and invalidate the protest. That's a long answer, and I haven't even gotten to the question of what we should do about it, but I can answer that now.
No, sure. I mean, we'll move through the opening questions, but I realize that was an enormous question. Essentially, that is the question we'll spend most of today discussing. So I definitely want to come back and dig in a little bit deeper on that. Professor Peck, for this moment, I'd like to move on to you. How significant a factor do you think that the ongoing protests and the deep divisions that Professor Lentz-Smith was just talking about over racial justice will be in this year's election? Is it easy to get a handle on that?
So a briefer question, but a really hard one to answer. I mean, as a historian, as an historian like Adriane, our job is usually not to predict, and for good reasons, because it is a challenge to know. I do think that the questions of violence is portrayed, that Adriane beautifully set up, that it's been a political weapon, really on the right for a long time, to portray peaceful protests as violence is the way in which, and to change the story from the systemic violence against people of color in policing to a story about saving our cities from protesters. That is the political strategy that the right has had for some time. I suppose the question then becomes, and that's not new. It was the Southern strategy. It was part of the Richard Nixon's campaign for the silent majority in '68. And right back to Jim Crow, and before that. I mean, you can think about the ways the abolitionists had encountered this. You know, that there was over who was a violent actor. So part of what the opportunity, I think, at this moment, and I think is really open, is that there is a very clear, because of documentary footage, because of the images, horrific as they are, of George Floyd's murder, that it's very hard to dislodge the narrative of the graphicness of the state's violence against people of color, that kind of argument on the right is is struggling to have the same inroads. So right now, there's clearly been a shift in public opinion. Initially, a very large shift. Half of Black Lives Matter, a kind of historic breakthrough. I think in June, there was a large rally in Eastern Kentucky, almost entirely white people protesting police violence. That is, that's not something really seen in a long time. And clear shifts in public opinion. And it's begun to swing back because of a kind of concerted effort to redefine the problem. I think the election will ratify some mixture of the two. I think it's become, when you combine that with COVID, the two most important election issues right now. It's not the economy. And so I think what we see right now is a fight over the image, over the representations, about how to clarify the stakes of the election. There's a kind of ideological battle occurring right now. And I can say more about the history of white supremacy as a narrative of white victimhood, which is really also this narrative of reframing the problem, so-called. white people are the ones who are ultimately victimized, Blue Lives Matter, et cetera. Whether that's going to work this election, I think is it's a great question. I'm not going to predict, but I think it is. I think the old playbook is not going to work the same way. And so,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I certainly do want to dig into this notion of the history of white supremacy and how the whole notion of white identity and white victimhood came about in the first place. Professor Jardina, I'd like to move on to you. And on that topic, in your book, you make a distinction between white identity and white racial discrimination. And what is that distinction and why is it especially important to understand right now?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when we talk about racism or we think about what the term racism means, we usually conceive of it as this sort of sense of antipathy or hostility or outgroup prejudice that many white Americans have toward people of color in the United States, and of course, historically toward Black Americans in particular. And one of the things that I've been examining in my own work is the fact that there are a number of white Americans who don't necessarily have this sense of racial hostility, but nevertheless feel that their group is somehow losing out, that it's losing its privileges and its statuses and the resources that many white Americans think that they have rightfully earned or that they ought to have. And that's where we start to see these conversations about white grievance politics, white identity politics. And so the problem, right, is that this is still a set of attitudes and beliefs that help maintain a system of racial inequality, that help perpetuate racism, but it's a very different set of psychological attitudes. And what that means for us in contemporary American society is that you now have two sets of white voters, two distinct sets of white voters who are arriving at a lot of their attitudes about immigration, about support for Trump, about the protest movement from very different perspectives. But both of these perspectives are working in the service of reinforcing racial inequality. And if we don't pay attention to both of these things, we're going to sort of miss the fact that there's an entire set of white voters who the politicians can tap into strategically without necessarily using either dog whistle or sort of implicit racist language in the sort of traditional use of the term, language that's about hostility toward Black Americans or toward immigrants or toward people of color. But this sort of more subtle language talking about the changing diversity of the country, for example, that taps into a different set of white voters who are also motivated to do things like support President Trump.
Gotcha. Thank you, all three of you, for those opening questions. Goodness me, there is certainly a lot to dig into here, more than we can cover in the time allotted, but we will do what we can. Professor Lentz-Smith, we've already mentioned here the 1968 presidential campaign. You've done a lot of work studying violence in San Diego in the early 1980s. There is this pattern, right, of retrenchment, reform. When you look at what's happening right now, is there anything that stands out to you as different? Do you think that it's just part of a cycle that this country seems to keep dragging itself through? What do you see right now as whether there are hints of progress or hints that we are just once again kind of cycling through?
Well, so, historians talk about change and continuity. So we always split the difference and say we are cycling through and we're changing at the same time, right? As I mentioned, there are certain parts of this, the narratives that people try to mobilize, a reliance in some ways on folks in power, on narratives, historical narratives, or of people's ignorance of the history that they are acting upon and acting through, that allows them to assert a kind of national innocence that makes them not responsible for rectifying that history, right? That's longstanding, it's ongoing. And the reaction that we see, the kind of anti-democratic reaction couched in the language of order that we see also belongs to an old playbook. That said, there is change. We have, although they've been weakened to some extent, kind of legal backstops, sort of law that we can go to, that we can draw on, that have moved the project democracy further. So even if there's rollback, one hopes that there are still tools and resources in place to push against that retrenchment. And then I think that there's not, as there was in the 1960s, as broad an imagination that America can only validly be white, right? There are all kinds of Americans. There are children of the 70s and the 80s and 90s who have grown up with a narrative of kind of broader civic nationalism. And even if it hasn't been total and it hasn't been fully encompassing, it's a resource there for other people. So it's a resource for groups who believe in the beauty of a broad kind of multiracial and multi-ethnic functional American democracy. They have kind of images and resources to reach to in a way that I'm not sure that the American mainstream had circa 1964, 1965. In the mid-century civil rights movement, the assumption and the sort of full-throated, right-in-your-face ideology of white supremacy and white goodness was so strong that the first job was to crack it. Our job now is to say that understanding isn't fully gone and we're not done cracking it, which is still a hard job. But if this is the hill, we're here on the hill as opposed to down here.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. Thank you very much. Professor Peck, I'd like to come back to you in this notion of white victimhood, because it seems like that has been one of the things that has put the brakes on progress with regards to racial justice in this country. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea, and specifically, you know, the shooting that we saw in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a white teenager shot two protesters, and the reaction to that seems to me to be a very kind of modern example of maybe how the notion of white victimhood works. I wonder if you could talk about that and maybe how that example helps illuminate it.
Sure. So, I mean, if you do, I mean, I think, and this speaks to actually both Adriane and Ashley's observations, I think that one of the things that's hard to get a handle on in this moment is the relationship between explicit, avowed white supremacists on the one hand, and what might be described as a kind of passive cohort of white citizens and voters who share some of those grievances, but don't want to be quite so violent or explicit about it. Doesn't mean it's not. So, but the young man who killed a protester and outside of Kenosha is example. There are others where in which the modern white supremacist movement, at the core of its ideology and its organizing strategy, is a narrative of that whites are the true victims in history, and that it's sort of predicated on a belief of a kind of zero-sum-ism, that any gains for people of color are necessarily depriving white people of their rights. It's an ahistoric understanding of how inequality has evolved in the United States, in the sense that very often, I mean, a great example of that is you know, after the Wilmington riot, in which African Americans were fully deprived of the right to vote in North Carolina, who lost power? Well, not only African Americans, but poor whites, because the first thing that the Democratic Party leaders did was to gut support for public education and what have you. So the real threat that white supremacists are seeking to counter is actually a biracial coalition, or the opportunity to rethink American inequality actually beyond simply racial terms. And this is also, I would highlight, it speaks to the fact that the protests on behalf of George Floyd, the protests against police violence, have been biracial and multiracial in the way they're organized and what they're articulating. So white supremacists today are seeking to counter that because they understand perhaps that that's a real threat. The way they do that is the narrative that whites are the historic victims. They privilege it as the sort of talking point. And you know, it's not a particularly, there's a story of continuity here that stretches right back to the 1840s and before that. So in terms of the images that are marshaled and how they do it. I would say, just one other point, I think what's interesting right now, the other thing that is different though, so there's continuity there. The thing that is different, to amplify Adriane's point about change and continuity, I do think this moment has witnessed an entire new generation speaking and organizing and discovering their voice, who are young and multiracial. And in that sense, it's been, they're changing the conversation and the way in which politics is even organized. And I would say, to answer better the question you asked me initially, people who protest are more likely to vote and to engage politically. And I think what that impact is going to look like in the fall is really important, because young people historically are the least likely to participate. So the fact that young people are leading this protest could have a transformative impact on the election in the fall.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I would point out that we had in a recent election briefing, Professor DeAndre Rose pointed out that while young voters often say they will vote and don't, we are seeing unprecedented levels of activism on campaigns among young people, which made her hopeful that they would make their voice heard. Professor Jardina, I wanted to move on to you and to follow up on this point that Professor Peck was making about activism amongst young people. Have you seen in your research where any changes in this notion of white identity, when maybe you compare young people to older people in that, how they see themselves racially, how they see themselves fitting into, a country that, as Professor Lentz-Smith pointed out, is, founded on this idea of the melting pot. It's supposed to be a multiracial country that benefits from all of the different nationalities that came together to form it. Do you see much difference between ages in this understanding of white identity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see differences with respect to age when it comes to white identity and to just racial prejudice generally. So young white Americans are far less likely to possess this sense of racial solidarity. They're far more likely to be sympathetic and supportive of racially progressive causes. And part of that, too, is that younger Americans are more educated than older generations of Americans. So one of the things that's really important to think about and to talk about is that there's not just an age gap, there's an education gap when it comes to support for racial protests and racial equality in the United States. White Americans who didn't go to college are far less likely to support the protest movements. They're less likely to support policies that help promote racial equality than white Americans who went to college and have a college degree. That's important to keep in mind here.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I would like to remind everybody on the call that you can ask questions directly into the Q&A window. You can type them in there, or if you would like to ask a question in person in Zoom, you can just raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you. If you are joining the Zoom call by phone, you can press *9 to put your hand up so that we can unmute you. We're going to move on here. And I wanted to talk about the impact of social media. Professor Peck, you mentioned about the very graphic images this summer that I think helped fuel some of the outrage over the death of George Floyd. And social media is obviously a huge difference that we see now that we didn't have, in the 80s and in the 60s, and obviously before that. I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Professor Lentz-Smith. How much of a difference do you think that is making? And of course, we see that Facebook and other social media platforms, they spread a lot of racist rhetoric, but they've also fostered a lot of racial justice and social justice movements. So, I mean, when you look at the pluses and minuses, is there anything in particular that stands out to you about how social media is affecting how we perceive these things?
I'm a funny person to ask because I'm a total Luddite. I don't have a Facebook account. I just learned what TikTok was, so on the one hand, I have a very fusty antiquarian response, which is grumble, grumble. It seems to me the end of civil discourse, but I don't think that's actually right. I think it's important to say first that, we didn't have social media in the 1960s or 1970s, but we had television, right? And before that, we had newspapers, and people used those forms of communication in much the same way that social media is used now, which is to say that certain activists within the civil rights movement relied very much on photographs and television coverage to portray, to show people who had not seen it, what it looked like for folks to be brutalized by police officers, right? So again, the change in continuity, we are seeing an intensification of strategy and or a form that we've seen in the past. What I think that social media feels is swiftness, right? How quickly people can communicate, how quickly an idea can take off, and how all sorts of folks can come with their understanding of that idea. you see the historians who are like, let's add some context to this. Let's fact check these claims. Let's offer language that academics use, things like intersectionality, and let that get mainstreamed in a particular way so that people have sharper analytical tools. On the flip side, people don't always have sharper analytical tools, right? So that quick circulation, even like throwing out terms but not fully understanding them, means that sometimes you have distorted understandings. So that's a non-answer. It's kind of laying out the issues. I'm not sure that we can, on balance, say social media is good or bad. I will say that I find it exhausting and emotionally taxing. And my experience, at least in this kind of era of COVID, is that many people who are taking on the world, like bringing all of the world into their living room without sort of pause or break, are finding themselves having all kinds of problems with anxiety and being unable to replenish their emotional resources that seem distressing to me.
Sure, absolutely. Professor Peck, one of the things I pull out there from what Professor Lentz-Smith was just saying is that obviously imagery is so powerful, in these cases, and social media obviously facilitate the sharing of the awful video of the death of George Floyd and other images. Do you think, ultimately, because before social media, we've seen that imagery is powerful in fostering these kind of movements, that what we're seeing in social media is, as Professor Lentz-Smith said, a speeding up of these things? Do these movements and perhaps even the progress move quicker because of that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that has been an instigating impact. And you can see in the struggle to control those as being built into the very strategies of police departments. And this explains what happened in part in my hometown of Rochester, New York, where the video was the key thing that was held away from the public for months, and then when it came, it predictably generated another firestorm. So I think there's a democratization in images and the creators that cell phones and other things have created, that we can see are holding authorities accountable or making them have to change the way they function. And that would be clearly a beneficial thing for a sense of like holding authorities accountable, speaking truth to power. At the same time, not to always complicate everything, there's also what was just said. Images make people reactive, and our politics in general is being organized in highly reactive ways. And you can see that the game, if you will, on one side with President Trump, trying to create the optic, if done inauthentically and in a hamstrung way, completely backfire. It's not an easy to manipulate images. And on the other hand, thinking of politics as simply a battle of images is dangerous because it disempowers. We are only in a reactive position as citizens and voters. One thing that is so striking about the movements this summer is how they were, even with reclaiming a public sphere in a really powerful way. And I would just urge you all to listen to one of our students, Lauren Howell, if you could find any footage of her leading protest movements in Raleigh, North Carolina. Extraordinary the voice that she found, and also the way and the person-to-person masked context in which she was doing it. I do think that is part of, it's not all images all the time, but there's no doubt that images are, there's a fight over them and that they constitute an increasing amount of our political discourse. And so I think that what I would say the solution is to find a way to use them, but not to the exclusion of the broader kinds of democratic participation that have historically used all kinds of tools to their advantage. So images are not new. Their political significance is not new. Maybe the immediacy is, though. I think that's absolutely right.
Sure, gotcha. Thank you very much. Professor Jardina, I'd like to move on. There was a point that Professor Lentz-Smith made very early on about how the problem is made out to be the protests and the violence rather than what caused the protests and the violence. And we know that one of the key aspects of white identity is this support of law and order. And so, you know, there are political leaders who will kind of hijack the support of law and order, say, look at the protests, you know, and all these terrible things are happening, and distract focus away from the problem that caused the protests in the first place. Do you see any movement on that when it comes to white identity and this identification of that with law and order? Do you see any? There's a shift, or there's an understanding that, you know, the problem is not the protest, the problem is actually the cause of the protest, and how does that focus get shifted?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things going on that are really important to keep in mind. So one is that white Americans historically have had a very low tolerance for protests, particularly protests around racial justice. So even coming out of the civil rights movement, when you had a considerable shift in white racial attitudes in the movement of being more sympathetic toward racial equality in the United States, a lot of that sympathy waned moving into the 1970s and with the protests that were happening in urban areas in the United States. And on the one hand, we might imagine seeing some of that today. I mean, there's some other forces at play. So, you know, just what we were talking about a minute ago is the fact that social media makes a lot of the racial injustices and police violence sort of undeniable. I think part of why you've seen so many white people turning out to protest this summer is in part because the murder of George Floyd wasn't something that was happenstance, or it was sort of unequivocal what happened because we had this video evidence. But the other thing that's really important for us to talk about and note is that we're not talking about sort of all white people here when we're talking about who's sort of sympathetic to racial equality, who's more likely to be swayed by these messages of law and order. The thing that's really different today than when we go back and look at some of the political strategies that, you know, Nixon used in moving from the 1960s all the way through Reagan in the 1980s is that white Americans are far more polarized partisanly around matters of race. So you've got this huge partisan gap between white Democrats and white Republicans. White Democrats are far more supportive of the protest movement than white Republicans. I think Pew just released some recent data about a week ago, and they found that 88% of white Democrats support the protests compared to 16% of white Republicans. So we're talking about a lot of white Americans who are already, for example, likely to vote for Joe Biden. And the question then becomes, moving into this election, is the extent to which white Americans who do care about the protests and are racially sympathetic are going to turn out to vote relative to the white Republicans who are more likely to be sympathetic to these messages of law and order, who don't find the protest movements appropriate, who don't see a lot of racial inequality in the United States, don't really believe that racial discrimination is as big of a problem as it actually is. And so in some ways, what we're going to be looking at is a mobilization game. Which side of the partisan aisle is going to do a better job of mobilizing its constituents? And while it's certainly true that protest is a very costly behavior, and we should feel, I think, hopeful that a lot of white Americans who were willing to turn out to protest are also going to show up to the polls, the other thing we've been seeing is that a lot of white Americans without a college degree in swing states have been registering to vote. So voter registration is up among that constituency. And so I think that introduces sort of a lot of unknowns moving into the election in November.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. Professor Lentz-Smith, when, you know, at the beginning we were talking about things to focus on that have come out of this summer, and one of the comments that you made to me in correspondence was about how when people are out protesting, they're also protesting the less visible things, and how the country's response to COVID kind of really illuminates some of these problems that we're not necessarily yelling about on a day-to-day basis, but that are just as bad, if not worse, as the police violence that we're seeing. Could you talk a little bit about how the country's response to COVID has really illuminated some of the structural problems that we've got regarding race?
Sure. Not just the country's response to COVID, but so there's COVID itself and the country's response, right? And one of the things that we saw as COVID became an emergency that sent people into their homes, that shut down schools, or what have you, was how precarious the safety net was, and how reliant we were on very particular, already overtaxed institutions to provide that safety net. So I always go back to the question of how is it that if school is not in session, children go hungry, right? There is something profoundly wrong there that we hadn't talked enough about prior to the spring shutdown. Similarly, we talk about how overtaxed hospitals were, the people who weren't going to hospitals because they couldn't afford it, the way in which the economic shutdown then put so many people in danger of being thrown out of their homes, right? All of these speak to ways in which the United States is not caring for the people who live within it that have to add COVID and the direction on the part of people in authority who cared more about not being proven to be wrong than they did about doing the right thing to take care of their citizens. And you just have this mess, right? And people felt that. They felt it in the most visceral way. Gunther said earlier that the issue in the election was not going to be the economy. It would be COVID and police violence. I would counter that actually COVID happens in the way that people actually are economic indicators, right? That is a story of the economy. We just actually talk poorly about the economy in day-to-day discourse. And so I think my answer for what do we do now is to actually imagine and implement a public health response to COVID that doesn't take it as a single issue matter, but begins to come at all of the pieces around COVID that we see feeding the urgency and actually visiting disaster upon people's everyday lives.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. Professor Peck, I wanted to follow up on something you mentioned earlier about the history of white supremacy, white victimhood. I mean, we know that obviously in America today, race is just a huge issue. But we also know that there was a time when race wasn't particularly an issue and it was made an issue. Are there any lessons from how that happened that could actually help us now as we try and untangle all of the problems this country is facing in that area?
Oh, this is a good question and a hard one to answer because I love what you're asking is about really where is the use to sunder something that has been so intractable and so persistent and knotted as white supremacy. I think I would say this, that if you look at, there are particular moments of rupture, or rather maybe anxiety and fragility within what we call white supremacy as a system. And so parties think about what is white supremacy. It's not simply white people having power. It is I think of it as a particular ideology that instead of, that has been most effective in maintaining white people's power. And that is this argument about white victimhood, because it displaces the really powerful arguments and the reality of the systemic nature of inequality and the unfairness of racism, as well as other types of injustice that have been visited on poor people. So those moments tend to be not solely, just look at the moments in where you have political leaders who understand that in coalition, I'm channeling the good work of Reverend Dr. Barber here, but it is often the interracial coalitions of poor people that have united in opposition to the violence of white supremacist politics that is not solely about injustice to Black people, but to a broader inequality in the system itself. And so if there are lessons, is that the way you tell those stories, that there are, first of all, kind of long history of resistance to narratives of white victimhood, and also to see that white victimhood is an ideology that seeks to silence a multiracial and also very often a kind of an economic justice argument that gives it life and that is powerful and has never been sundered, in fact, by the idea of white supremacy. So I think that's it's a long-winded answer, a way of saying that if we see these ideas in opposition and in dialogue, and that there are historic people who have been remarkable. Just a few examples. Douglas, why was he reaching out to Irish workers in the 1840s so much, or lecturing in Ireland? It's because he knew that the abolitionist project was stronger, more successful, more radical if you had that coalition. Ultimately, it foundered, but that is a good example of how to fight that argument. Or the early Tom Watson. He's a great, initially became powerful by arguing that the future of it was built on organizing both Black and white farmers. He became a white supremacist, but his early message is one we should learn from. Wilmington Race Riot I already mentioned, or in the 1960s, there was a poor person's campaign that is the model for Barber's current campaign. So there is an alternative understanding of inequality and racial injustice that links into other politics that we should be mindful of, and see that that is in some ways one of the pressure points on what we call white supremacy.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense.
So Gunther, can I jump in and just say that implicit in what you said too is the idea or the understanding that many people came to, that white supremacy was a way to discipline white people, just as it was to discipline other races, right? This wasn't about the success of everybody. It was a way of keeping people in line so that they did not advocate things for themselves that would make their lives better, white people.
Yes, exactly. So white supremacy has from, I would argue, and I look at this in a book that I'm just finishing, but like the ideology of white victimhood is seeking to discipline poor whites and to get them basically to identify, and they're the ones who are the most dangerous in effect, because if they do find common cause, you have a much more transformative political coalition. What's I think interesting about this moment, I think the instability in our politics is among young people. Actually, to echo what Ashley was noting earlier, there are young people on both sides that are being polarized, to be sure, but young people have historically been discounted, and if they were to show up, they're a voting bloc that could make a really transformative impact. And so part of the effort right now on the right is to silence young people generally. And we see that in all kinds of voting laws that penalize transient voters and what have you. So that's an interesting place of conflict right now as well, and vulnerability within the older, I guess the older ideology of power that is.
Sure. Absolutely, thank you. And thank you, Professor Lentz-Smith, for that additional context. I would point out, we are having a series of election briefings, some of which are addressing these very issues that people can join. I'll give you more details about that later. Professor Jardina, I'd like to come back to you. We've actually had a question from within the chat for you, and it involves wondering whether if you have any data on, have you looked at undecided white voters and how important, whether you have any sense of how important racial identity is to the way that these undecided voters vote, because obviously they seem like this very strange group. How on earth could you be undecided at this point in time? But of course, those people are there and they decide elections. Do you have any sense, is there any data or any way to understand whether this strange disparate group of undecided white voters, whether racial identity is particularly important to them?
Yeah, so actually, we do find that people who identify as political independents are also disproportionately likely to possess the sense of white identity. So what that does suggest is that among undecided white voters, there's a good chance that they're going to lean toward the Republican Party. On the other hand, the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that political scientists who studied undecided white voters know that for the most part, they're not actually that undecided. Most Americans lead toward one party or the other. They're often reluctant to reveal their partisan identification when asked by surveyors or when asked by pollsters. And I think that the thing that we ought to worry about there is that probably part of that anxiety lies in the fact that many of those probably do lean toward Trump and are reluctant to mention that. And so I think that we're probably undercounting those people in some of our polling data, and they do, I think, leave some room for us to be, I think, increasingly uncertain about the extent to which some of the horse race polls that we're seeing coming out of polling organizations today are accurately representing the difference between Biden and Trump right now.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We're going to wrap up here shortly, but it feels like we will be remiss to end this briefing without mentioning Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away at the end of last week. She was obviously primarily known as a champion of women and women's rights. But Professor Lentz-Smith, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about a partnership she had to help form their views, and what a loss you feel like she might be to the court in the area of civil rights.
Well, I think that she'll be a tremendous loss to the court in the area of civil rights. She'll be a tremendous loss to the court, period. She's thoughtful, experienced, wise, determined. I fear that they don't make them much like Ruth Bader Ginsburg anymore. But you know, she's known as a champion of women's rights, but she's a really important person to think about in thinking about the place where women's rights and civil rights that we think of as being, you know, kind of related to minority communities intersect. And she came to the understanding of that intersection through Durham's own Pauli Murray, who was herself a tremendously important activist and kind of legal, a figure in the law who kind of puts us at the intersection of race, sex, and sexuality, right? She was a queer woman. And Pauli Murray had an idea of something that she called Jane Crow, this idea that race discrimination and sex discrimination were of a piece. And Pauli Murray was the person who came up with the strategy in the own court cases that she was pursuing of applying in the absence of an equal rights amendment, of applying the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment to sex discrimination, to the protection of women and women's rights. And it's that insight and that key that Ginsburg is able to build upon in her own legal strategies and in her own thinking as a jurist. So we're beholden to both of them tremendously. And what the world needs right now is some amazing combination of the two of them to swoop in and save us like Wonder Woman.
And wouldn't that be something? If either of our other panelists have anything to add to that, then please do. I'll give you a second to speak up.
I would just say, I think there is a Wonder Woman from North Carolina who I would love to see on the Supreme Court, and that is our state Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls, who has a kind of track record of civil rights advocacy, of learning from plaintiffs, of doing the kind of learning from the complexity of injustice. It is exactly the kind of historical brilliance that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had. And I would hope that she would be on a short list of justices if there were to be a Democratic administration appointing or nominating rather a Democratic justice.
Thank you. Professor Jardina, anything to add about the legacy of RBG?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say that I think is really relevant to the conversation we're having here today is that Ginsburg was particularly an advocate of affirmative action in colleges and universities, and court rulings over the past several decades have been chipping away at universities' ability to use race as part of their admissions criteria. And in the most recent Supreme Court decision on this, Fisher v. Texas, Ginsburg wrote a particularly compelling opinion about the need to continue to allow universities to continue to use race as a criteria. And I think one of the things that we very well might expect to see now is when affirmative action inevitably makes its way back to the Supreme Court, that we're likely to largely see the end of it, unfortunately, without sort of another liberal justice on the court to replace Ginsburg, which obviously right now there's a lot of uncertainty and unlikelihood that that's going to happen.
Thank you for that, and thank you all of the panelists for those closing answers. While it seems a shame to leave it on a kind of a downer, certainly that's 2020 for you. I appreciate all the panelists tackling these enormous questions. I know they were big questions and impossible to answer, but I guess we have to start somewhere, right? But we will leave it there. I think if we've learned anything, it is, once again, we know that the children are our future, as was sung so memorably by Eddie Murphy as Randy Watson in Coming to America. But we'll leave it there. Thank you ever so much to our panelists, Adriane Lentz-Smith, Gunther Peck, and Ashley Jardina. Thanks everybody for joining us. Next week's briefing is on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern, and that we'll be discussing potential threats to a fair and free election here in the US, in case we weren't all in a good enough mood already. If you'd like to attend that event, please email news@duke.edu. In the meantime, thank you everybody. Please stay well, stay safe, and have a great day.